My name is Abigail Carter, and at 32, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal the medical field could offer. As the clinical education coordinator at Fairview General Medical Center in Westfield, Ohio, I'd spent 6 years building programs that turned eager nursing students into competent professionals. The sterile corridors of our 400-bed facility had become my second home, and I took pride in maintaining the highest standards of patient care and professional ethics. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was reviewing student evaluations in my office when I noticed an unusual pattern in our Epic system logs. Someone had been accessing patient records during off hours, specifically visitor restriction information. The timestamp showed activity well past the end of clinical rotations, when students should have been home studying or sleeping. I initially dismissed it as a technical glitch. Our IT department had been updating security protocols, and system anomalies weren't uncommon during transitions. But the pattern persisted over several weeks, always the same type of records, always during the same late-night hours. The atmosphere in the medical surgical unit felt different too. Conversations would stop when I approached, and some of the nursing staff seemed unusually guarded during our routine check-ins. Even Diana Ellis, our usually chatty charge nurse, had become distant and professional in a way that felt forced. What troubled me most was watching my star student, Ethan Morrison. For 3 months, he'd been exceptional, arriving early, staying late, asking thoughtful questions about patient care protocols. His clinical skills were advancing rapidly, and several attending physicians had specifically requested him for their rotations. I'd been considering recommending him for our accelerated program. But lately, Ethan had been different. He'd grown secretive about his patient assignments, deflecting questions about his documentation with nervous laughter. During our weekly one-on-ones, his usual enthusiasm had been replaced by an anxious energy that set my teeth on edge. The breaking point came during a routine HIPAA compliance audit. Our privacy officer, Catherine Ellis, pulled me aside after reviewing the quarterly access reports. Her expression was grim as she handed me a printed summary of unauthorized database queries. "Abigail, we need to talk about your nursing students," she said quietly. "Someone's been mining patient visitor restriction data, and the access patterns suggest it's happening during your program's clinical hours." I stared at the report, my stomach dropping as I recognized the user credentials. The betrayal wasn't coming from some external threat or disgruntled employee. It was coming from within my own program, from someone I'd trusted with the most vulnerable aspects of patient care. As I sat in my office that evening, watching the sun set through the narrow windows, I realized that everything I thought I knew about professional integrity was about to be tested. The silence in the empty corridors felt ominous, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I arrived at Fairview General an hour early, determined to understand what Catherine's audit had uncovered. The hospital's main corridor was still dim, with only the emergency lighting casting long shadows across the polished floors. I used my badge to access the administrative wing, where the silence felt heavier than usual. In my office, I spread out the HIPAA compliance reports Catherine had given me. The data painted a disturbing picture. Over the past 6 weeks, someone had systematically accessed patient visitor restriction information across multiple departments. The queries weren't random. They showed a deliberate pattern of searching for specific types of cases, particularly those involving domestic violence situations and witness protection protocols. What made my blood run cold was the timing. Every unauthorized access had occurred during clinical hours when my nursing students were on rotation. The user credentials belonged to a generic training account that all students shared for educational purposes, making it impossible to identify the specific individual from the logs alone. I thought back to how this mentorship had begun. Ethan Morrison had been assigned to me in September, fresh from his second year of nursing, full with stellar academic records and glowing recommendations from his previous clinical supervisors. His enthusiasm had been infectious. He'd volunteered for extra shifts, helped with inventory management, and even stayed late to observe complex procedures. During our first week together, I'd been impressed by his attention to detail. While other students struggled with the hospital's Epic system, Ethan had mastered the interface quickly, navigating patient charts with an ease that suggested natural aptitude. I'd praised his technical skills, even recommending him for advanced database training that would give him broader access to patient information systems. Now, reviewing those early weeks, I wondered if I'd missed warning signs. There had been small incidents that seemed insignificant at the time. Ethan asking unusually specific questions about visitor policies, his interest in security protocols that went beyond normal student curiosity. I'd attributed it to thoroughness, the mark of someone who took patient safety seriously. The first real red flag had appeared 3 weeks ago during a routine patient admission. Mrs. Rodriguez, a domestic violence survivor, had been brought in with injuries that required her to be placed under visitor restrictions for her own protection. Only immediate family and law enforcement were authorized to know her location within the hospital. I'd been reviewing her chart when Ethan approached, offering to help with the documentation. His questions had seemed appropriate, asking about proper coding for restricted access, understanding the legal requirements for maintaining patient confidentiality. But later that day, I'd noticed him lingering near the nurses' station, apparently reviewing charts that weren't assigned to our unit. When I'd asked about it, Ethan had explained that he was conducting research for a paper on hospital security protocols. His answer had satisfied me then, but now it felt rehearsed, too convenient. The pattern had continued over the following weeks. Ethan would volunteer for cases involving patients with complex visitor restrictions, always with plausible educational reasons. He developed relationships with staff across multiple departments, using his charm and apparent dedication to gain access to areas beyond his assigned rotation. Diana Ellis had mentioned seeing him in the psychiatric ward during his off hours, claiming he was observing intake procedures. The emergency department staff knew him by name, impressed by his willingness to help during busy periods. Even the security team had grown comfortable with his presence, often allowing him to pass through restricted areas without the usual verification protocols. I realized now that Ethan had been systematically building a network of trust throughout the hospital, positioning himself to access information far beyond what any nursing student should need. The thought made me feel sick, not just because of the violation itself, but because I'd been the one to facilitate it. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Ellis. "Can you meet me in conference room B at 10 a.m.? Need to discuss the audit findings before we escalate." As I walked through the hospital corridors that morning, everything felt different. The familiar sounds of medical equipment and staff conversations seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I passed the nurses' station where Ethan usually checked in, noting his absence with a mixture of relief and dread. In conference room B, Catherine had spread out additional documentation, printed emails, access logs, and what appeared to be external communication records. Her expression was grave as she gestured for me to sit. "Abigail, this is worse than we initially thought," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The visitor restriction data that was accessed, it wasn't just viewed. Someone has been systematically copying and potentially sharing this information with outside parties." She handed me a series of printed emails that IT had recovered from the hospital server logs. The messages were cryptic but clearly referenced patient information, using coded language that suggested the sender was familiar with medical terminology and hospital procedures. "We believe someone has been selling patient location data to private investigators, possibly for use in custody disputes or domestic violence cases," Catherine continued. "The financial implications alone could destroy this hospital, not to mention the danger to our patients." As she spoke, I felt the weight of my own complicity settling over me like a heavy blanket. I'd trusted Ethan, vouched for him, given him access and opportunities that he'd used to betray everything we stood for as healthcare professionals. "There's something else," Catherine said, pulling out a final document. "Security footage from last Tuesday shows your student accessing the database after hours, using credentials that should have been deactivated. He had help from someone on the inside, someone with administrative privileges who could override the automatic logout protocols." The room felt like it was spinning as I processed this information. Not only had Ethan betrayed my trust, but he'd recruited an accomplice within the hospital staff. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than I'd imagined, and I was beginning to understand that my role as his mentor had made me an unwitting facilitator of a serious criminal enterprise. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Catherine's expression softened slightly. "We need to gather more evidence before we can act. Can you continue working with him normally while we investigate? We need to understand the full extent of the operation before we involve law enforcement." As I left the conference room, I felt like I was walking through a nightmare. The hospital corridors that had once felt like home now seemed threatening and unfamiliar. Every colleague I passed could potentially be involved in the conspiracy, and every patient room represented a potential victim of Ethan's betrayal. When I finally encountered Ethan later that afternoon, his smile seemed different, calculated and false in a way I'd never noticed before. As he approached with his usual cheerful greeting, I realized that everything I thought I knew about trust, mentorship, and professional integrity was about to be shattered completely. The next few days passed in a surreal haze of forced normalcy. I continued my rounds, supervised other students, and maintained my professional demeanor while internally wrestling with the knowledge that Ethan was systematically exploiting our patients' most vulnerable moments. Every time he approached me with questions or updates, I had to suppress the urge to confront him directly. Catherine had been clear about the need for discretion, but the weight of keeping this secret was crushing. During our morning huddles, I watched Ethan interact with other staff members, wondering if any of them were his accomplices. The administrative override Catherine had mentioned meant someone with significant system privileges was involved, possibly someone I worked with daily, someone I trusted. On Thursday morning, I received a text from Catherine asking me to meet her in the hospital's unused conference room on the 3rd floor. When I arrived, I found her with 2 people I didn't recognize, a woman in a business suit and a man with a hospital security badge I'd never seen before. "Abigail, this is Detective Sarah Morrison from the Westfield Police Department's Cybercrime Unit, and this is James Chen, our new internal security consultant," Catherine said, her voice carefully neutral. "We need to discuss the next phase of our investigation." Detective Morrison opened a laptop and turned the screen toward me. "We've been monitoring the database access logs for the past week, and we've identified a pattern. Your student has been accessing patient records during specific time windows when certain administrative staff members are on duty. We believe he's coordinating with someone who can mask his activities in the system logs." The screen showed a series of timestamps and user IDs that meant nothing to me, but the detective's expression was grim. "What we need now is for you to help us catch him in the act. We want you to create an opportunity for him to access restricted information while we're monitoring the system in real time." My stomach dropped. "You want me to set him up?" "We want you to give him the rope he's already chosen to hang himself with," James Chen said quietly. "Based on our analysis, he's been targeting patients with specific visitor restrictions, usually domestic violence cases or patients in witness protection. He's selling access to their locations to people who shouldn't have that information." The full horror of what Ethan had been doing hit me like a physical blow. These weren't just privacy violations. He was potentially putting vulnerable people in danger for money. The patients who came to us seeking safety and healing were being betrayed by someone they trusted with their most sensitive information. "How do we do this?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Detective Morrison outlined the plan. "I would mention to Ethan that we had a new patient in the ICU with unusual visitor restrictions, someone who might be of interest to his contacts. They would monitor all database activity during our conversation and track any subsequent unauthorized access attempts." The next morning, I found Ethan in the break room during his usual coffee break. My hands were shaking slightly as I poured myself a cup, trying to appear casual while knowing that every word I was about to say was being recorded. "Busy night in the ICU," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "We admitted someone around midnight. High-profile case with some unusual security protocols." Ethan's interest was immediate and unmistakable. "Oh, what kind of security protocols?" "Complete visitor restriction, no information to be released to anyone without direct authorization from the attending physician. Even the family has to go through special channels." I paused, watching his expression carefully. The kind of case that makes you wonder what someone's running from, you know? His eyes lit up with the predatory interest I'd somehow missed before. "That does sound intriguing. What room are they in?" "ICU 7, I said, the fictional room number feeling like poison on my tongue. "But you didn't hear that from me." Within an hour, Catherine texted me, "We got him." The confrontation happened that afternoon in the same conference room where this nightmare had begun. Ethan sat across from Detective Morrison, James Chen, and Catherine, his usual confident demeanor cracking as they presented the evidence against him. We have logs showing 17 unauthorized database accesses over the past 6 weeks, Detective Morrison said, her voice professionally cold. Each access corresponded with patient information that was subsequently sold to third parties. We've traced payments totaling over $8,000 to accounts linked to your name. Ethan's face had gone pale, but he still tried to maintain his innocence. I don't know what you're talking about. I only access patient information as part of my clinical duties. James Chen opened his laptop and turned it toward Ethan. This morning at 10:47 a.m., you attempted to access the record for a patient in ICU 7. A patient who doesn't exist. The only way you could have known about this fictional case was through your conversation with Nurse Carter, and the only reason you would have tried to access that information was to sell it. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the facade finally crumbled, and Ethan's true nature was revealed. The young man I'd mentored, encouraged, and trusted was nothing more than a predator who had used my guidance to perfect his exploitation of vulnerable patients. Who else is involved? Catherine asked. We know you had help with the administrative overrides. Ethan's shoulders sagged in defeat. It was Dr. Ethan Phillips in IT support. He helped me bypass the automatic logout protocols and hide my access patterns in exchange for a cut of the profits. The revelation that Dr. Phillips, someone I'd worked with for 3 years, was involved felt like another betrayal. How many people in this hospital had I trusted who were willing to sell out our patients for money? As security escorted Ethan from the building, his student badge and access credentials confiscated, I felt a complex mixture of relief and devastation. The immediate threat was over, but the damage to my faith in the profession I'd dedicated my life to felt irreparable. Catherine found me in the hallway afterward, still processing what had just happened. You did the right thing, Abigail. Without your cooperation, we never would have caught them. I should have seen it sooner, I said, the guilt finally breaking through my professional composure. I was his mentor. I was supposed to protect our patients, and instead I gave him the tools to exploit them. You couldn't have known, she said firmly. Predators like Ethan are skilled at manipulation. They choose their targets carefully, people with integrity who would never suspect such betrayal because they're incapable of it themselves. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded. Dr. Phillips was arrested, and the hospital implemented new security protocols to prevent similar breaches. The patients whose information had been compromised were notified and provided with additional security measures. Some chose to transfer to other facilities, their trust in Fairview General irreparably damaged. The hardest part was facing the other nursing students in my program. They looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion, wondering how I could have been so blind to what was happening under my supervision. Some questioned whether they could trust my guidance, and I couldn't blame them. But gradually, as the shock wore off and the new security measures proved effective, the hospital began to heal. The administration praised my role in exposing the conspiracy, and I was asked to help develop new training protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. Standing in my office 6 weeks after Ethan's arrest, looking at the commendation letter from the hospital board, I realized that while my trust had been shattered, my commitment to protecting patients had only grown stronger. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed the importance of vigilance in safeguarding the people who depended on us for their care and safety. 12 months later, I stood in the conference room at Cleveland Medical Institute, watching a room full of healthcare professionals take notes as I concluded my presentation on advanced HIPAA compliance protocols. The irony wasn't lost on me. My greatest professional failure had become the foundation for my most meaningful work. Remember, I said to the attentive faces before me, trust is the cornerstone of healthcare, but verification is what protects our patients. Every access, every request, every exception to protocol must be documented and justified. After the session, a young nurse approached me. Ms. Carter, thank you for sharing your experience. It takes courage to turn something so painful into education for others. I smiled, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that now felt purposeful rather than burdensome. That's exactly why we do this work, to ensure it never happens again. The drive back to Westfield gave me time to reflect on how much had changed. Fairview General had offered me a promotion to Chief Privacy Officer, but I'd chosen a different path. Developing training programs allowed me to reach healthcare professionals across Ohio, sharing the hard-learned lessons from that devastating betrayal. Catherine had been promoted to nursing supervisor and still sent me updates about the improved security culture at Fairview, the new protocols we'd helped implement, had become a model for other hospitals in the region. Ethan's nursing license had been permanently revoked, and Dr. Phillips was serving a federal sentence for healthcare fraud and privacy violations. My apartment felt different now, quieter, but not empty. The hypervigilance that had consumed me in those first months after the investigation had gradually softened into a healthy awareness. I'd learned to trust again, carefully and with clear boundaries, but trust nonetheless. The nursing students in my current program at Cleveland Medical knew my story. Rather than seeing it as a weakness, they viewed it as proof that even experienced professionals could be deceived, making vigilance everyone's responsibility. Their respect felt earned in a way that my previous reputation never had. Opening my laptop to review tomorrow's curriculum, I felt a sense of completion that had eluded me for so long. The betrayal would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it had become the catalyst for protecting countless patients I would never meet, through the healthcare professionals I trained to recognize the warning signs I had missed. The evening news played softly in the background, but for once, I wasn't listening for updates about healthcare scandals or privacy breaches. The work continued, but the desperate urgency that had driven me for months had transformed into steady, purposeful dedication. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Another hospital wants to implement your training program. You're making a real difference, Abigail." I set the phone aside and returned to my lesson plans, feeling something I hadn't experienced since before Ethan's betrayal. Genuine peace with my professional purpose. The silence in my apartment wasn't the hollow quiet of isolation, but the calm that comes after a storm has passed and the rebuilding is complete. It was finally over, and the silence felt earned.